To episode 5 of the Axiom of the Infinite Unknown. And I am James, still no nickname. And we have, if you want to introduce yourself.
You're on the quarrelsome.
There we go. So we're going to finish up our look at this HR McMaster article on the Atlantic called it. So is it called What China Wants or How China Sees the World? Yeah, I think it might be both, depending on whatever was doing the best on the search algorithms. That's the way it works now. Basically, they just keep changing the title until it seems to sort of take root of people's interest. And we're going to look at specifically part 2 of the article, because I feel as though we covered part 1 and part 3 quite well in our last episode. Go back and watch it. And part 2 is the 3 prongs. And those 3 prongs consist of so it's Made in China 2020. 2025 actually, I think it was called. Made in China 2025. It's the Belt and Road Policy. And it's they gave a name to their military thing. It was something like the military civil fusion. That sound right to you? And so those are the 3 prongs. Made in China 2025, Belt and Road Policy, and the military civil fusion. And so we're going to explore that and its implications as best we can. Obviously, we're not experts on the field, but even a conversation among amateurs can help to spark the minds of those listening and get people interested in and realizing things that perhaps they were previously ignorant to. That's the way everything that we know now, at one point we did not know. So we're all living in a constant state of ignorance. It's one of the founding philosophies of the name of this podcast, isn't it? We are navigating ignorance at all times. Okay. And so the only way one of the best ways to navigate that ignorance is to know of what you are ignorant. And hopefully we're going to explore some of that in greater detail now with this look at this extra part of the China article. So do you want to kick off with Made in China 2025? The sort of the stealing of American intellectual property and technology and all of this.
I'm really interested to hear your views on this, because this particularly seemed to strike you as of interest. So I think because you work in the tech world, your exposures to conversations around this stuff and thoughts around this are probably, like, my understanding is very, very simplistic based on just what was in the article and picking up bits and pieces and in often hearing snide remarks about Chinese companies essentially having a daytime shift and a nighttime shift. For the daytime shift, they're making products for the company that's hiring them, and the nighttime shift is they're making the exact same product and not telling the company about it and selling it themselves. And also, I suppose, as the only kind of point I think is worth laying out there philosophically is, again, in relation to the fact that I'd like to highlight in relation to the 2025 thing, is that, again, the fact that this is even a thing is because it's a place that doesn't have rule of law. So you can just, if you have enough influence within the CCP, or you just have enough money, essentially, you can just do what you want. Yeah. And that includes just taking intellectual property via share, not even like with espionage, like taking stuff off drives and stuff on companies that you're affiliated with, but even just the fact that they don't respect copyright laws and patent laws that were done elsewhere. So and that's because, again, it's a dictatorship that doesn't have rule of law, and all the power is consolidated in one place, which is the CCP. So that's just a kind of like a fundamental difference straight off the bat there between the Western world largely and what goes on in China. So, but apart from that, I'd love to hear your thoughts, because this seemed to strike you as particularly interesting from our chats.
Oh yeah, no. So I suppose so. It's important to tackle this in such a way as to acknowledge what people might see as, dodgy, skirting the lines of ethics, but not fully criminal, at least not to the degree that we should be looking at this over and above, say, Iran's treatment of women and this sort of thing. There are awful things going on in the world, and so to place your focus here, it's not an unfair question to say that that's worth justification. I think the way I would sort of approach that concern or doubt is to say there are these more traditional ways of stealing, and you have these, as you said, Chinese factories that American companies are hiring out these factories, subjecting Chinese workers to pretty intense labor conditions, to the degree that we know of Foxconn stories from a few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago now, where the people who were making the iPhones in these Foxconn factories in China, they had to install safety nets outside of the building because enough people were throwing themselves out of the window because they couldn't take it anymore, that they literally had to put nets up. And so you hear these stories and you go, and then you want me to hate China because those factories are then turned on to make similar parts. Like, come on, it's the least you can give them is their ability to then take this new knowledge they've acquired, these new machines they've had to build our phones, and then use them to build their own stuff. And to that I say, if we were looking at that, fair enough. But we're not just looking at that. We're looking at Steve, who came up with a new cool toy for dogs, and it's a design where the dogs get plenty of exercise, it trains their teeth, all of this, and it's just a thing he came up with when he was trying to train his own dog, and he got a patent for it through the American system. It was granted to him. He's a small business owner. He supplies the blueprint or the modeling to the factory in China, and now the factory in China have taken that, so it has been sold on, and now there is a Chinese manufacturer with far more money behind it and the state behind it, who are now selling this product. It's on China's version of Amazon. It's also on Amazon, and now he's got no company anymore because they're able to sell it for cheaper because it's direct. And so we're talking about that all the way up into the scale of what one of the White House officials described as the greatest wealth redistribution in the world. The amount of intellectual property and technological advancements that China have just wholesale stolen from our intelligence institutions, our universities, our technological companies, the highest tech companies in San Francisco and Austin and all of this, it amounts to the greatest wealth redistribution as he described it. And that's worth taking very seriously. And so then you look into that and you say, okay, well, there's the economic ramifications of this, but there's also all of the ramifications which mean that every time we have an advantage over and above those of our peers, that's just stolen with none of the R&D, none of the investment that's gone into it. And it's been allowed to bubble, to come to fruition, to conclude with this great discovery or this new way of going about a problem or something. And then China go, that's useful, pluck, and it's as insidious as planting people in universities and having those students report back, all the way up until forcing companies that want to have access to the Chinese market to enter into a joint venture in which all information and data is shared, and so all of their intellectual property is just by necessity shared with China. And this is more of an issue if we go back to what we were talking about before, and then I'll wrap up because you've given me a long time to talk about this. When you recognize that the state interference with companies is unlike what we understand here. If we have a problem with Donald Trump owning hotels and becoming the president, we're like, he can't own a hotel and be the president. Poof. Like, how does this happen? How does he own hotels and he's the president? There, the Chinese state ownership over companies is literally have Chinese government officials on the board of companies. They have the board report to China. They have workers within the company submitted by the Chinese government. They have those workers back and forth working for the government and then working for the companies. It's like it's incestuous to a degree that we wouldn't even understand. And so when you're saying that, these companies are stealing it, we're talking about the Chinese state stealing it, using it for their military progress, their intellectual progress, their universities, their research into nuclear. All of this stuff is now theirs, built on the back of the hard work of the Western states. And so, I think it's a really important prong in this three-prong thing. I'm really glad that he's talking about it.
A point that jumps to mind for me is that quote. I can't think it might have been the comedian Brian Callen. I heard him say in an interview before. I don't know where he got it or if he came up with it. Is that you can put a gun to a fella's head and get him to move a box, but you can't put a gun to a fella's head and get him to come up with a good idea. Yeah, and I think that's the reality. If you look at dictatorships around the world, it doesn't surprise me. It's not surprising that they don't come up with stuff.
No,
because there's not the same freedom of information. And even if you do come up with an idea, even if there was the same passing of information and freedom of press and exchange of ideas and opportunities to explore and to innovate without being just taken by the government, let's say, for saying things that aren't nice to say, let's say, about them. So, like, an example would be about that. This is a point, actually, as a side tangent, a quick tangent. It occurred to me as well that another really important thing to say about China as an example is that if me and you lived in China, we wouldn't be able to put up this podcast or the one we put up last week.
Yeah.
That's a really important point. Is like, because you just go missing. You could just be taken, like.
Yeah, no. Well, we wouldn't have access to YouTube anyway.
No.
They don't have YouTube, so
use VPNs or something to get up onto YouTube, and
then you're already illegal, so you're already a criminal.
Yeah, and if you could get up onto YouTube using a VPN, then you put something up there that criticizes the government, you can just be taken in for questioning and worse. So, like, so anyway, back to the actual the point. So even if there was the ability for, because anytime there's innovation, like, innovation is just a form of creativity, and creativity is just a combination of known parts in an unknown way to solve a problem. So, like, if you are driven to come up with a new idea or innovation, like Steve with the dog toy, there's not really any incentive to do it because your idea can't be protected because it's not yours, because there isn't protection of intellectual property. So there's not even an incentive apart from just the joy of creating something if someone wanted to do that just for its own sake. But there's not any drive because you can't, from an economic sense anyway, so that you can't protect your idea. So I think that's a really important. So as a product of that, a major criticism of China that I've encountered over the years is that they'll never be able to take over the world because they don't come up with their own ideas. And kind of a point, I suppose, that I think is worth countering to that is, while that may have been the case in the past, they're now copying innovations so quickly that it doesn't really matter that they're not coming up with their own ideas.
No. The only time that matters is when they're so big that other countries are unable to innovate in a way that they can steal.
What I mean doesn't matter. I don't mean doesn't matter in terms of doesn't affect the rest of the world. I mean doesn't matter in terms of to them they're not losing.
Exactly, yeah.
So they're able to reproduce innovations by someone else fast enough that it doesn't matter to them that they're not coming up with their own good stuff. But
Yeah.
I think what the only time at which that will be the case and it will matter greatly is when that paradigm shift or that leap occurs to AI. Like when that leap occurs to a powerful enough AI, then the rate of growth will be much faster than can be caught up with.
Oh yeah, exactly.
But that's the only point at which, like, that's why I don't. There's certain things I think that the Chinese government will get away with. Sorry, I think that there's innovations potentially in gene manipulation and biological stuff that it will occur in China before anywhere else, not because they have the ability to innovate in terms of because they have all these blockages to information, all these other negatives. But what they can do is do whatever they want to human beings. They don't have the human rights regulations and laws that are around the rest of the world, or animals as well. They don't give a fuck. So I think the only place I can see China really progressing on innovations is in continuing to get better at cheating with regards to stealing intellectual property, because there is incentives to get better at stealing stuff.
That is true.
So they'll innovate in ways of getting better at taking stuff, but then because there is massive incentives for that, and then they'll be able to innovate in areas that human rights laws or animal rights laws and cruelty laws anywhere else in the developed world would put a halt to experiment.
I feel as though that feeds really nicely into the Belt and Road policy as well, because that is a matter of the ethics of their behaviour, or the lack thereof, allowing for progress in ways that we would either be unwilling to do or are incapable of doing. So that's to say, the capturing Africa underneath the debt to China, and in terms of incapable, the willingness of China to say, our leader is here for the next 40 years, and so we're going to have a plan that lasts that long. Yeah. So those two things, we are with Western history in terms of the transatlantic slave trade and the colonialization of many countries across the globe, just mean that we are unwilling to invest in Africa in any other way that is not simply a donation or aid. We are willing to give, but we aren't willing to build up a reciprocal relationship such that we give you this in return for something, because then that indebts them to us, and we don't want to be in that situation again.
An important caveat there, though, is that when we say, because I agree with you, but I think when we say we don't mean that there, of course, aren't. Well, I think from my side of it is as I agree with you on that side, except that I think a caveat is that that's not to say that there aren't specific companies that are of Western origin that are probably at this moment doing things within Africa. But
really good point.
I think that we have a free press that, if reported, the goings on in those places would affect that company's reputation in the West. Whereas
an example would be the mining of certain minerals from African countries that are required for our iPhones. We're aware of them, of the tungsten and all of this stuff that we need to dig out, and what that does to the communities and stuff. You have the whole blood diamonds saga a couple of decades back of where do our diamonds come from, like what are we doing to these people. So as you say, the free press.
But even when the blood diamond situation came out and emerged, wasn't there a massive shift away from conflict diamonds? So because people
That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
the population-wide consciousness shifted in terms of because they had knowledge, they had the awareness, their consciousness shifted, and then all of a sudden, then they wanted diamonds that were conflict-free. So then I think that's what I think. What I mean when I say we, and I think it might have been what you were insinuating as well, that it's not to say that there aren't companies that are doing unpleasant things of Western origin, but if regular people found out about those companies we had their reputation tarnished. Similarly, there's politicians that we probably en masse be less likely to elect if they were the kind of politician that would put poor, underdeveloped countries in fucked up economic situations in order to take advantage of them.
Yeah, it was definitely the grander we, such that is inclusive therein of the we that holds the rest of the we accountable, which is to say the free press. We are this self-accountability operation where something goes wrong over here and this part points to it and goes, correct this now. And that's how it functions. That's how it functions the way it's done. You take away this component though, and you have a China where they can operate however they want. They can put millions of Uyghurs in concentration camps, and there's no element that points to it and goes, do we want this in our country, guys? Because all the state has to do is come out and block that straight away, like kill the person who said that, and then also say, we're not. What are you talking about? And everyone goes, well, they said they're not, and nobody's proven they are, and we can't get external news sources, and any external news sources that leak in, we're given explanations directly from our government as to why it's propaganda and why they hate us. So, yeah, no, absolutely, that's a really good point. Thank you for that clarification. Yeah. And, so I suppose that is... to go back, I do just want to mention to those that were... In terms of the Made in China 2025, to those that have any interest in this stuff, I would highly recommend you look into Huawei as the prime example of this. You look into their 5G towers. You look into why the FBI and the intelligence agencies in America have decided we're not willing to have these towers in our country. And then you start questioning why it is that in Britain and in the UK and in other European countries they are so willing to cut these deals with China. And we need to become conscious of this as a nation, as a populace, because at the moment we're oblivious to the implications of sort of having these Huawei towers capturing all of our data when we know that the Chinese state is directly implicated in the company. So yeah, just that I just wanted to make that point. And I feel as though the Belt and Road
Huawei is the archetypal. Huawei is the
perfect. It's the Ne Plus Ultra of this.
Yeah.
So is there anything that you'd like to say specifically about the Belt and Road Initiative? Maybe if you were to talk about Xi's run, and you touched on it in the last episode, exactly why it is that we've got to this situation where he can run for so long, because he's manipulated the governmental system to mean that he's no longer accountable in elections. But maybe you can talk to the implications of that and why it's good and why it's bad, because there are positives to it as well.
Yeah, so we chatted about the last time, and I just kind of highlighted it. In 2017, he was never really, like, the thing about the presidency, so just to summarize the points I made in the previous episode, was that there are three main roles in the Chinese government. There's the head of the Communist Party, the head of the military, and the presidency. And they're basically always the same person. But two of those roles don't have term limits. The head of the military, the head of the Communist Party, but the third role does, the presidency. So in 2017, under the auspices of claiming that all he was doing was aligning the term limit situation between the three jobs, President Xi essentially made himself into Emperor Xi, because he did two things. One, he essentially got rid of the term limits on the presidency, which it was never really an election anyway, because it's an election, I suppose. There's kind of like a pseudo election kind of a thing within the Communist Party, but it's not, and it's only within this major this series of councils within the Communist Party, but it's not like a democratic election, say, where like an average Joe who just isn't involved in the CCP and just works in a company, he doesn't get any voice at all in who the president is, like you would with regards to which party you vote for the whichever party you'd prefer the prime minister to emerge from. Yeah. You get a chance to do that. I get a chance to do that in Ireland, and we also get to vote for our president here, which is a kind of more. Our president here in Ireland is more of a similar role to. It's like the royal family in the UK, essentially, except it's also an elected position, which is more kind of this figurehead that okays things or vetoes things, rather than someone who is has the head of state. The head of state here is essentially the prime minister, or the Taoiseach, same as in the UK. But anyway. And the second thing he did in 2017 was he failed to elect his successor. So the successor, essentially, again, to summarize the points in the previous chat, typically what would happen is the president would do one term, and then towards the end of that term, they'd select a successor from this. I think it's a council of 7, I think. I can't remember the precise detail, but they'd select their successor. That's going to be the next president. And then during his second term, his successor essentially waters down some of his power, because all of a sudden now people are placating to him because he's going to be the next president for the next term by himself. So essentially this guy kind of almost, you could think of it as like gets trained in for 5 years, and then eventually the other guy finishes his second term and the new guy is kind of onboarded into the presidency. Whereas the successor wasn't elected. So when it comes to the Chinese state now at the moment, even if Xi Jinping decides to leave out of his own will because of political pressure or whatever, I can't imagine he'll put a successor in place that's going to have his own voice and won't just be a puppet for him. But the likelihood is, what I can imagine is that, what I suppose, given the current circumstances, I could see him, the only reason I could see him getting out and shifting is if there was enough of a rumblings publicly that was a discontent with the coronavirus or with something else economically, or something happens, or there's like a really violent suppression of of some protests somewhere, or
another
something.
Tiananmen Square.
Yeah.
Or maybe this coronavirus situation means that so many companies pull out of manufacturing in China, move to Vietnam, Indonesia, that they're massively hit.
Yeah. And even then, just given what I know about Xi Jinping at the moment, he kind of considers himself a kind of a Mao character, do you know? Like, he doesn't consider himself like, to put it in perspective, part of the presidency is that you come up with a contribution in part of the Chinese presidency is that you create a contribution to the Communist Party philosophy, body of philosophy, and he's only one of 3 people that put his name on his philosophical contribution, and one of the other 3 was Mao. So there was, like, I can't remember the particular Mao, the name of Mao's one, but his contribution, Xi Jinping's one, is something along the lines of Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics. That's the name of his philosophical contribution to the communist body of knowledge. So, and I can't remember the name of Mao's one, but Mao's one, I think, also had the word thought in the name. So he was by using that, he was putting himself up on the pedestal with Mao.
Yeah, exactly.
So, like, I think Xi kind of sees himself as that kind of a person. So even if he does step aside for whatever reasons, his stepping aside will be purely aesthetic, and it won't be an actual departing of leadership. He'll put some pawn in place, and so anyway. So, and then another point that we talked about the last day was that, and you highlighted it earlier on actually, was that a major benefit of a dictatorship is that you can plan in much longer blocks, that because you're not subject to the will of a people. So a major flaw with democracy, to illustrate first, is that because our election cycles are in 4 years or 5 years or whatever, depending on the country and depending on the job, we're stuck to thinking in, okay, what have you done for me lately? What are you going to do to me? What are you going to do for me in this next block after you get elected? So then, as a result, we think short term. We don't think in 20-year blocks. We don't think in we're going to make these sacrifices now. We're going to put these steps in place. We're going to plant these seeds now.
That's exactly the point. Yeah.
We have a better education system, or we have a better prison system, or we have a better social care system. We can take care of disadvantaged people, or people that are dispossessed for whatever reason, because of disability or because of growing up in very unpleasant familial situations or economic circumstances. We don't think that far ahead, because it's in not election cycles. That's a major flaw of our current thought process.
It has ramifications for climate change policy, because the government now aren't the government in the future, where the full wrath wrought by the climate change, the human created climate change, won't be felt until they're gone, maybe dead. And so there's for Belt and Road policy, that is a really great example of what China can do that we can't.
Yeah, and the willingness. So like, there's that time scale thing. Like, and you brought up climate change. Think about the Western world and how slow we were to react to the virus. Literally until there was bodies piling up. In the vast majority of countries, there was already bodies piling before anyone did anything. So think about that, and then think about the way that affects something like climate change. What will be the thing that gets us to act? If in the matter of only a few weeks we saw bodies piling up, the thing about climate change is it's not going to happen in China first and then happen in fucking.
We literally had Italy. We don't have Earth 2, where Earth 2's already where we can see Earth 2 and it's just, oh my god, look at that. Look at what's happening to Earth 2 with climate change. Let's stop. But we had Italy, and that wasn't enough. So even if we had an Earth 2, that might not even be enough for us. Yeah. Like, having Italy, seeing what happened there, and you still had Boris Johnson in hospital saying, I'm still shaking hands, I'm still, I was in the hospital, they had coronavirus patients, and I was going around shaking hands, because we've got to, people live differently, and I'm going to live like this, and then he freaking gets coronavirus, and then the whole thing changes. Now UK is looking to be the most severe lockdown country in the world, because we had this massive pendulum swing, and it's all because we didn't do what we should have up front.
Yeah, and it's precisely, man. And so think about that same example as it relates to climate change. It's like that mirror. So we don't think. Not only do we not think a few weeks ahead, because we can't. We don't have complex. First of all, there aren't, it seems, any complexity theorists in positions of influence in any Western government. Like, there aren't complexity thinkers in any institution, in any position of influence, in any Western government or institution. So that seems to be a big problem. The fact that there aren't people that understand exponential growth curves, they don't understand emergent properties in complex systems. There's
no Taleb in the White House.
No, there's no Taleb in the White House. There's no Taleb in Downing Street. There's no Taleb in our Oireachtas. There's no. So anyway. So I think, yeah. So that with the Belt and Road, I suppose that the last point I'd like to make is just that like, they're able to think in very long blocks that we don't even consider as an option. No. They're thinking in time scales. Like, they're like, we can put this stuff in place now so that in 20 years' time we control these key ports and these key transport routes.
I feel as though the Belt and Road for me is the one where, actually, out of the three, that's the one I respect more than the other two, because it's the one I feel as though we should have been doing as well. I actually think that is, I think we should, obviously not in the same way, but the core idea behind that Belt and Road policy is a good one.
And it's not even that we should have been doing it in terms of, because you can see the hesitancy. Obviously, it's not that we should have been doing it from how would you call it, a colonialist kind of military intervention sense, or even like this economic mob. What did you call it last week? A mob shakedown sense.
Shakedown, yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. It's not. But I'm speaking more to that Yuval Noah Harari sense of globalization, of international cooperation. That's the sense of what I'm thinking of. Like, we have our parts. we have our connections in Africa owned by, well, let's say Nigeria or Egypt, or we have our connections within any one of those countries that allow for a more deeper integration of how we flow through the world.
And more, and it would have actually like genuinely been like, imagine if you had enough, because if you have enough people with let's say Western liberal democratic values that have interests in these ports and these airports and stuff like that, not because they own them, but because their business interests are there, then that's going to facilitate the maintenance of democratic institutions within those countries, and there'll be more wealth dispersed and more interaction between developed and undeveloped nations. So that's because but I can see the hesitancy as well, because
no, I understand it.
The colonial past that Western civilization has, and the fact that there was such a drive for so long to pull out of India, to pull out, let's say the UK, using England as an example, pull out of India, pull out of Pakistan, pull out of all over the Middle East, pull out of Africa, and same with the French and the Dutch and the Spanish and everything. It's like pulling out of their colonial bases. So you can see the hesitancy to go back doing it, but the problem has been that it created a kind of a vacuum that could be exploited by a nation with enough wealth and ideological fascism as well. So like a sense of innate superiority, like we talked about the last.
Yeah, it's not a benign government that's picking off the peripheries left behind by the colonies. It's not a sort of a benign. It's not a benign party that's going, oh well, we'll sort of pick it up if you've left it on the floor. I'm equally hesitant. I feel as though there would have been an amicable and respectable way to keep those connections, because I feel as though a more integrated world is actually our way out of climate change, technological revolution, all of this stuff. Do you want to move on to the third one?
Yeah,
I guess.
Definitely.
Because we're coming up on time already.
Yeah.
Moves quickly. So yeah, the last one is the military-civil fusion, and H.R. McMaster describes this as the most totalitarian of the three, and it's effectively because it just insists that all Chinese companies must collaborate in gathering intelligence. So now we have the FBI. Well, not we. The US have the FBI. We have MI5. I don't know what the Irish equivalent is. These are our intelligence gathering agencies. They're remote, isolated organizations that are in charge of gathering intelligence. The Article 7, that China's Article 7, it reads, any organization or citizen shall support, assist with, and collaborate with the state intelligence work in accordance with the law, and keep the secrets of the national intelligence work known to the public. So it's basically like, by the way, everyone in China, you're all MI5 agents. Like, so when we have a lecturer in Cambridge University who's of Chinese origin, he came over 10 years ago, he is considered by his family and his friends and his previous work associates as obligated to report back any intelligence from Cambridge University. And we had this recently with a university teacher in America who has been found guilty of working for the Chinese state whilst he's been working at university. So this feeds back into the very first point of Made in China 2025, where it's effectively like, we are welcoming the stealing of intelligence, but every time we say, yeah, come on, we will pay for Chinese students to come over to our universities. What do they call them? Confucius schools. They have the Confucius schools in America, in universities. You have your Confucius club or whatever, where it's basically like you can practice CCP, sort of policy in this sort of isolated. I need to read. I'm ignorant about it to a certain degree, but people are calling for the shutdown of this stuff, especially following the COVID-19, because this is where propaganda is allowed to circulate and maintain itself in other countries. It's just it's remarkable. I can't believe how explicit it is. I can't believe it's mental. Like, literally, you are obligated, you are required as a citizen or a company to gather intelligence for us.
And that's like, I think one of the things that McMaster said just after he said that, if I remember correctly, was that the role of the Western governments, he's specifically talking about the US, but I think you can expand it across to UK or Ireland or anywhere else as well, is that these people who are sending information or who are within the nation but pressuring people to send information, actually that they should be fucking removed, send them home. But that's because we want to protect the ones that are currently here that don't want to do that stuff.
Exactly.
Because obviously, even though Article 7 obligates them to be, Article 7 is what includes the individual as well, isn't it? Not just the
the citizen. Yeah.
So, like, even though Article 7 obligates the citizen to be a spy, essentially, like, it doesn't mean that every citizen wants to do that.
No, exactly. And this is very much like the I suppose it's analogous in a sense to the terrorism problem. When you have 0.001% of Muslims who are willing to blow themselves up, how is it of high moral integrity to say, well, there's this tiny minority that wants to blow themselves up, so all Muslims can't come into the country? Yeah. We disgusted us when Trump had the Muslim ban. It disgusted us, rightly so. So you can't say, in a case like that, well, we just have to get rid of all of these people. There are so many Chinese
Muslim ban, especially because Trump's Muslim ban didn't block the country that the actual terror.
Saudi Arabia was still fine as well. It was like, okay, cool, yeah. No, exactly. That had that. It was obviously ideologically motivated, that one. It wasn't out of political interest or national concern. But with this, you're totally right. This is going to be a fine line to skate, but it's something of which we need to be wary. We just need to be. We need to recognise that this is something that is happening, and it's something that. Pardon?
And it can't be ignored.
No, exactly.
It can't. It's happening. It's reality. It can't be ignored, and it is not politically incorrect to have this discussion.
Oh, like, no, yeah, no.
And this is another point. That's like, there's this fear of anytime you question any form of immigration, that you're seen as a xenophobe or a kind of a racist, restrictionist person. Yeah. That's not the fucking case with this kind of conversation. Similarly, like you mentioned, it's not the case with Muslims. So, like, it is a factually correct statement to say that all jihadis that blow themselves up are Muslim, but not all Muslims are jihadis who blow themselves up. Exactly. And that's a factually accurate statement. It might be somewhat inflammatory if people don't understand what I just said, but it's factually accurate. And it's the same thing with these Chinese spies. It's like, all Chinese spies are Chinese, but not all Chinese people are spies.
Yeah. Yeah.
All the same. Like, it's the same idea. So then it comes down to, well, there's nuance to be discussed here, where it's not let no one in, and it's not let everyone in. It's let in the people, or let the people stay here that are not acting against the interests of the country.
And because this is far more specific. So whereas you have if you stick with the current analogy that we're using, the Muslim analogy, where you have this subsection of Muslims that are, so you have a lot of conservative Muslims who just, as we see them, are conservative because maybe they feel a certain way about gay rights and things. And then you have a smaller subsection, maybe 20% or so, or even lower, like 15, 10%, who are Islamist, and therefore they want to see the introduction of something like a Sharia law into other countries. And then you have a much smaller percentage who are jihadist. And so you're talking about these gradations.
In Islamism.
Yeah. And each one of those people is dangerous to a different degree. And so the conservative Muslims are dangerous in as much as, well, you're free to have your ideas, so we can't reject you, but we have to recognize that you're going to feel a certain way about gay people, trans people, women. That doesn't accord with our liberal values. And then you have Islamists where it's like, well, we need to be careful about how you maneuver through politics. If we have you in high political positions, that's dangerous for us. Jihadists, they're just dangerous, full stop. You can't have them in a house and them not be dangerous. Chinese people are, well, Chinese spies, the minority of Chinese people, are dangerous only in those institutions that have anything of high worth in regard to intelligence. And so if you're placing them in really top-end technologically advanced companies who are on the forefront of research, then there needs to be a massive background check, as you would hopefully do with everybody. If you're just placing them in a local supermarket or they're a teacher, then they're a teacher in a secondary school. Who gives a crap? What intelligence are they going to send back? Like, no intelligence that you couldn't just get firsthand from New York Times or something, or the Guardian that we're already writing about. So it's very easy to say, okay, well, actually, we don't need to worry about the immigration part of it. We only need to worry about the background checks when it comes time to do those background checks, which are appropriate to the job. So it actually isn't all that murky, but for some reason we're still incapable of doing it. It shouldn't be that hard. It really shouldn't be that. If I wanted to work somewhere that had access to highly valuable intelligence, I should be checked out. Do you know what I mean? They should be watching this and going, what's James think? Like, they should be going through all of the stuff I produce and ask people about me, because we should be very careful with who has access to that stuff. But we're not to the degree that we should be.
100%, man. I think that's good timing as well for finishing up on it, because I think at that point, it's that acknowledgement of nuance, man, and like this is what's been missing for so long in the standard discourse in traditional media, legacy media. The standard discourse has been missing out on nuance and context and shades of grey, and it's been this over focusing on binary blacks and whites at the expense of all the shades in grey that the actual real world occurs in. So like, and I think Eric Weinstein had a great line where he kind of considers himself xenophilic restrictionist.
Yeah, I like that.
And that he loves studying and interacting with other cultures. His own wife is Indian, I think. He loves Indian music, all sorts of other cultures, music, art, literature. But he's aware that you can't have open borders. So there needs to be, and he has some particular viewpoints on why that's the case as it relates to certain things in education, for example. And
labour, import, and
but
driving down salaries.
But that point, but that particular, the amount of nuance that needs to be addressed when someone hears the phrase xenophilic restrictionist, that's the same nuance that needs to be addressed with Islamic terrorism and Chinese spies. You know, it's the same. It's the same context. It's the exact same situation. It's like not closed borders, not open borders. What's between the two? Shades of grey. It's not black and white. It's just shades of grey all the way.
I feel that this actually feeds in really well to the very premise on which we base this podcast. Is it's already difficult enough navigating uncertainty and ignorance. We're already basically feeling our way through the fact that we can be certain about nothing other than we can be certain about nothing. And to then with those few dim glimmers of light that we've managed to set up such that we don't keep walking into the same wall over and over again, we are blinding ourselves and putting them out by saying you can't talk about this, you can't talk about that. And we're making it even harder for ourselves to do what is already an incredibly difficult task. Talk about things that we'll never know if we're 100% right. We can only be more or less confident. And so when you start saying you can't talk about this thing over which we have more confidence, it's like, but that was one of the few things we did have. So you're just making it worse.
Yeah. Yeah, but just like you said about earlier on, I think the common thread that runs between the aspects of Western civilization that makes it so good the common thread is that of error correction. Just like you highlighted earlier on, if something happens over here, these people pointed out, and that error correction is why capitalism works, markets, it's why markets work. It's a fundamental reason as to why markets work. It's a fundamental reason as to why democracy works, and it's a fundamental reason as to why science works. It's error correction. But the only way we can correct errors is if we can actually confront information. So if there's certain things we can't even discuss, then there's errors that may exist that we can't even acknowledge or correct. Let the mind correct, because we can't even acknowledge that they exist.
Exactly.
So
I did, yeah.
But
no, perfect.
I'll be blessed to finish. I have to tear off myself now.
Nice one. I'm really happy with this. I feel as though we covered it quite well. I look forward. We'll discuss what to do next, and with that we'll sign off. So that's the Axiom of the Infinite Unknown, episode 5, and that was How China Sees the World by HR McMaster, part 2.
Peace, man.
See you, Ciaran.
Great. Same time next week, yeah.
Sure, man.
Nice. Good luck, buddy.